to Urban Maestras Rising,
where bi-weekly we will be covering topics centered on educating BIPOC students as BIPOC educators born and bred in NYC.
We welcome parents, allies, and educators to be part of our community of listeners.
If you are ready to take the next steps into these needed conversations,
then you've come to the right place.
We are your hosts,
Jackie
and Jazz.
Hi, everyone. So this is episode 3, COVID and New York City Schools. That's our title for today. We've been on a bit of a hiatus on the podcast because, of course, we've been completely overwhelmed with the beginning of the school year in a pandemic. But we'll dig into all of that in this episode. But just to backtrack a little bit, we want to follow up with our last episode on the importance of the census.
Okay, so our last push to you all was regarding the census, and now due to the financial disparities of this pandemic, it is super important. Well, it was super important for everyone to fill out the census application. The deadline initially was on October 31st, but then it was changed to October 15th. And there was already a lot of controversy about moving that deadline because then that would mean that the numbers wouldn't be captured accurately. And as we mentioned, this is a money's game. So if certain individuals aren't captured, then that means less funding for certain areas. And so if you did get a chance to go and fill out the census, thank you so much. And yeah, let's continue with today's episode.
Yeah, well, a little bit of gossip on the census stuff is like one of the census workers was still walking around and like filling things out beginning of October, and I went up to him like, wasn't the census deadline the end of September? And he explained to me like, no, it was extended to 31st, but then he's saying that a bill was trying to be passed to shorten that deadline to the 15th, and it did. That ended up happening. They ended up shortening it to the 15th, so that's why there was that change. So I just wanted to give you guys a scoop on that. So, alrighty, getting down to business here. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between equality and equity. So the equity in our schools has been super, super, super obvious ever since this pandemic started. So here in New York City, we were the epicenter. The week of March 15th, New York City schools were shut down. And since March up until June, we were all teaching remotely. Now, fast forward a little bit to September. We basically started again school, but the model is different. It's not full remote. Some parents have the option of, well, not some. You have the option to either put your child in full remote or in blended learning, which means some days you'll be in school and some days you will learn remotely.
And it averages out to like, you go to school, if you're in the blended model where you're part in person, part online, you end up going to school typically, well, depending on the model your school selects, about twice or 3 times every 3 weeks or so because it cycles through. So not a lot.
And the class size is super small. So I think the limit is 10 to 12 kids per classroom.
It all depends on the square footage of like the room. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, opposed to like how it was before where we could fill up to 32 kids in a classroom, but that's another conversation for another time. But here in the city, in New York City especially, like our schools are super, super packed. So adjusting to this new model and like the challenges that come with it has been pretty overwhelming. But this whole like teaching and learning in a pandemic has really brought to light things that were in the dark and have always been an issue, but now is like super obvious. So equality means treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities, while equity is proportional representation. And to kind of give you like an example of what that would look like. So equality would like be giving everyone the opportunity to get the job, regardless of race, able body or not, gender and etc. While equity is not providing wheelchair access to one of your employees that needs wheelchair accessibility because they are in a wheelchair. So that's what equity is as opposed to equality. So this whole pandemic situation that we're currently living has really brought to light the equity issues that we had even before, but now it's like a thousand times worse. So you'll hear a lot like these issues have been exacerbated, and just meaning like bringing it to times a thousand, in like how bad it is. So yeah,
Yeah.
what were like what were some usual challenges we had before COVID?
Well, before COVID, especially in education, time, money, resources, like the allocation of human capital and like um, getting funding for particular programs was always an issue. And as Jackie mentioned, with all the struggles of COVID and having to revamp the whole education system, it's created even more inequities because, as it was when it came to technology, there's something called the digital divide. And the digital divide pretty much means that students from low socioeconomic status tend to see technology as a tool for fun. It reminds me of those memes that go around on Instagram. Like, do you have games? Because that is like their take on tech. And other students that are affluent know that technology can be used for research, for reading, for learning. And so these oftentimes poor communities, like, yes, I feel like public schools did a great job of deploying tech quickly and trying as best as they could to provide internet access through like tablets and things. But
Hmm.
even in terms of shifting that culture of seeing tech as an instructional tool is a big shift for students.
Yeah, because
Um,
it's like they're not exposed to it as often. So like when they get their hands on it, it's like, ooh,
right,
kind of like a piece of candy. But now it's like getting transitioning them into like, all right, this is going to be a learning tool for you. It's not just for playing around.
right. Like the novelty. Like I know initially when I was teaching, some of my kids, I could tell they weren't necessarily paying attention to me, but it was because they were using the YouTube feature and they were watching certain things. Um, well, with all that being said, if we think about what COVID did to these communities, we're talking about Washington Heights, we're talking about a lot of the Bronx. Um, a lot of people lost their jobs. There's
Hmm.
trauma. There's loss of benefits. And to be completely honest, when it comes to remote versus in person, when you're poor and you're relying either on one income or on the income of two parents that are working multiple jobs, it's not an option to go in person
Right.
unless you have like a grandmother or a neighbor that's willing to stay with the child. And that's a huge ask because it's a matter of consistent supervision and
Yeah, because like on the days they're not going into school, who's gonna be at home like helping them log on to things and like supervising and making sure they stay on task.
right, and that whole tech aspect of like helping them navigate different platforms, and it's messy even on the teacher end. Imagine being a child or being like an older person and having to assist with that.
Hmm.
um Jackie recently showed me an episode from Vice News. It's called How Learning Pods Could Widen the Educational Gap. And really, learning pods is something that emerged because of COVID. And it's an initiative brought on by parents to address the gap, but specifically more for white affluent families. And so,
It's like little like communities that they're building within their community of like, if the gap in a sense of like, oh, I see that my child is not understanding the remote math the teacher's doing. We need to figure something out and like get them a tutor or a specialist or rent a space. So we have, because not this group of 5 kids are having the same problem. So it's kind of like what the learning pods
right,
are.
and sometimes it can even extend to like extracurricular activities, like let's pay a person to teach all of our children violin or horseback riding. And
Hmm.
oftentimes these pods can cost up to $40,000 per kid. So it's almost like, it almost seems like a daycare program, but it's for school age children. And it does, it provides specials. It's like a pseudo school. Let's think of it that way. But the issue is that other families, they have limited access. All
And
they
like,
have is, go ahead.
oh yeah, you know, but like saying like who got $40,000? Not everybody.
Right. That's not an option. It's not an option to buy into that. So it's
Right.
almost like in Spanish, how we have like a sociedad, or like a society where like um you kind of pull money, but this society is specifically for like making sure that your child's education is up to par in
Right.
prices. Um so yeah, so a lot of families don't have that. Parents from low socioeconomic status, they have to do things like change their work shift. And if they're lucky enough to have a two-parent home, possibly one can work the night shift, the other one can work the day shift, which was the example in the video. They showed a family in Brooklyn that had about 3 to 4 children learning all in a pretty small apartment, and the parents would take turns supporting. And really, that was the remote instruction, or I'm not sure if they were in the blended model, but I think this was more in the springtime, right?
Yeah, I think
So,
so.
so they were talking about fully remote. Um, so the parents were in there just trying to support, and the end all and be all of instruction was that iPad or that Chromebook. It wasn't a society or
Hmm.
this partnership that was created. And really, if we think about it right now, the projection is it's going to be 12 to 18 months of kids not being in physical schools or not in the same capacity as they were before.
Yeah.
So
And
this is
like this
a
doesn't it
major
make you
shift.
think of like if we were in this pandemic when we were kids, like we would not be in those learning. I know I wouldn't be in no learning pod. I would be in a room filled with all my siblings trying to help each other out and wearing headphones because, you know, everybody's overlapping and stuff.
Right. And even so, those headphones, like I have kids in my class, and they're in a room, and sometimes I ask them, like, are you able to move to the kitchen or something? And it's not possible. And it's a lot. It's a lot to navigate for like the families that they're with. And yeah. So in thinking about these pods and how it's creating another problem, because the analogy that was used in the video, they said everyone else is getting a lifeboat right now. Like, let's think of that family that's in Brooklyn and that they're almost taking shifts, taking care of their kid. They're like getting a lifeboat right now, barely making it right now, or like
A raft.
surviving,
A
right?
raft.
They're surviving. It's like a raft, pretty much, right? Whereas these parents that are creating these pods, they're pretty much giving themselves a steamboat. Like they're going full throttle, making things happen, which sounds awesome, right, for that group. But then it just further creates inequities and makes it harder.
And then
Um,
the thing is like these pods aren't creating new problems. The thing is that, you know, who had access before to tutoring, paid tutoring, and violin lessons before all of this? You know what I mean? It wasn't the kids, the inner city school kids, unless it was like some program where someone paid a bunch of money to allow these kids have access to these things. But even before all of this, like those same people that are doing the learning pods, they had the same opportunity before. Um,
Absolutely.
mm-hmm,
If now it's just more that they're a bit more organized about it, in terms of almost creating like a collective where
mm-hmm.
it's not one child that's like now getting horseback riding lessons, it's multiple children. Um, so yeah, it's hard as a teacher that our school is pretty diverse in terms of we have an affluent population and we have a low SES population.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it. Like there's interruptions in my lessons where kids are like, "Oh, I'm taking horseback riding right now," or "I'm getting my violin lesson. Sorry I was late." Whereas the other children, they're having tech issues.
They were late because they couldn't log in or their server
Right.
was off or something. And like that's super obvious. Like somebody coming in late because they were horseback riding or whatever, versus a kid that was like probably sitting there for half an hour, super stressed out and like probably going back and forth with family members and trying to figure things out. You're gonna walk into that room completely differently. Like the other kid is like stressed because they're like, yeah, they've been stressed trying to just get in there. You know what I mean? Like
Absolutely.
Which makes me think a lot about like students' mental health, and like we need to check in on our kids and ask them how they're doing, and let them talk about how they're feeling and they're confused and all of that, giving them that space, even though we don't have the answers for them, because like it is already hard to put this into into language as an adult. Imagine how the children feel. So just like it's okay for them to feel how they're feeling, because this is not normal. And if you're feeling frustrated and scared and nervous and anxious, those are all normal things to feel in a chaotic situation like this. But we definitely have to check in with them more and ask them how they're doing, and ask them for their feedback. I know personally, I don't really pressure my kids with assignments. Like, yes, I give them assignments. They're there. I give them reminders, but I'm not like, these have to be done. Like, I'm not doing that because I understand the multiple scenarios going on at home.
Right.
But they feel the anxiety anyway. Like, I had a kid come up to me. He's like, he wrote me a note. Well, he wrote down his feelings because that's one of his like coping strategies, his calming strategies. And he's like, like I wrote this because I'm feeling many things right now. And he like wrote sad, nervous, and worried. And I was like, okay. So I had a conversation with him, and he's like basically telling me he was stressed out because he felt like he didn't fill out the whole worksheet in the previous workshop, and this is in person.
Hmm.
So he just felt worried like he didn't do his work well enough, and he was still carrying that on in the next lesson. And this is a kid that's able to like speak his truth, with no like um he's very confident in just coming up to me and telling me these things. So I think it's important to get our students, our kids, used to talking about like, yo, I'm frustrated, like I'm having a hard time right now. So like him telling me that, I was like, damn, like he's still stressed out from something that just happened. And like I know he is, but I needed him to tell me that too, just to like just speak his truth.
Right.
um
And even like just taking a moment, because the same way that if something happens and like it emerges naturally, we take like what's called the teachable moment and we take the moment to like unpack whatever happened. It's in
mhm.
the same sense, but now this has a more of a social emotional spin on it, where it's like sometimes we do need to slow it down because this is not a normal time. And honestly speaking, this is going to take a while for it to go back to normal. And so it's like we're reestablishing that new normal, and our new normal has to include real check-ins where kids feel supported and kids feel like they can have a myriad of feelings and that be okay.
Yeah, and like I told him, I was like, thank you for sharing that for me. And for me, it was like more of like a tug for me, like, yo, hold on, like slow down, even if it's for 5 minutes. Because
Yeah.
then on my end, I'm like, oh my God, I gotta get through these lessons. I don't want them to go home, not feeling like they didn't do everything at school. Um, and then I explained it to him. I was like, oh, I'm sorry, like, like thank you for telling me. That was a really good practice of you just coming up to me and telling me like what's going on with your feelings. And it was a good way for me to be like, okay, like check myself too.
Yeah.
And kind of like step away from like the pressure of what I just said, of like trying to complete things. Um so these conversations are very, very important, and they're going to be empowering for the kids. um yeah, so I do talk a lot of, we have been covering a lot of social emotional lessons. Like I don't want to say we're required to do, because I feel like there's been a big push for like the last 2 years anyway, before the pandemic, of social emotional learning in schools. But I think now is like super, super crucial.
Yeah, like
So
also public schools came out with a guide called Bridge to Schools, and the recommendation was pretty much 2 weeks of social emotional learning where kids would acclimate to the new setting, and just making sure that like we normalize asking how they're feeling and giving them coping strategies, because at any moment something trivial could really make them feel overwhelmed. And
yeah,
so we had that training.
yeah, we did. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about some other training that we found was like the perfect timing for as well. But back to like students' mental health. One of the lessons I had recently, there were two, because like this program that we're using, like one week we focus on different topics. So we were focusing on, I believe last week, anger. And, I was asking them like towards the end of like, I guess like the little like module, what are your ways, calming strategies? So they suggested three, like exercise, I forgot the other two. Oh, positive self-talk, and then I forgot what's the other. Oh, taking deep breaths. And then I asked them like, "Oh, what do you do?" And they just started telling me like these, oh, coloring, drawing. I take a break and go to a different part of the house. Uh, One of the kids started telling me about this book that their mom read them called Casa de Emociones, and she like went in and explained to me how it helped her like identify her feelings and this and that. And I was like, wow, like these kids, like they know what they're doing, and it reflects of the conversations they're having at home as well.
Absolutely.
So I know the parents are having conversations with them too. So I thought it was a wonderful conversation. And then this week we were focusing on worry.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, all right, so like what are some common strategies for worry? And they were like, oh, they're the same when we're angry. And because I have like a chart with all the responses displayed in the classroom. So we had that conversation. Like sometimes, the same strategies we apply for like multiple feelings. So yeah, I encourage that everybody continue having conversations. And if you haven't started, start them. A good place to start is, let's be honest about how we're feeling, what's going on, and giving each other grace.
Yeah, and it doesn't only have to be like over a meal. It can just be at any point when you're either with your child or you're dealing with a child. Start that conversation and work on building that relationship.
So there's been like a lot of, like I was just mentioning, initiatives, period, especially in public schools. So we're going to talk about a little bit of like the responses to COVID and initiatives that are being put in place.
But that'll be in part two, so stay tuned. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Urban Maestras Rising.
Follow us on our Instagram account, Urban Maestra Rising.
Please remember to share, like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Hit the bell icon for notifications to stay up to date with our episodes.
Goodbye.
Bye.